Hey everybody. Well, it's been a little while since I've done a Patreon video here, so thanks for sticking around with me. I have been working on a big research project here while we've been all holed up with this COVID-19, so I want to share it with you guys. So this project is about nightclubs of New York City, and the golden age of nightclubs from the 1910s through the 1940s. Now, a lot of times when we talk about like the history of swing music or of swing dancing, what we focus on is these famous figures or contributors, dates of important records, contests, particular films that show the dancing, the evolution of the music or the dance, things like that. But when I'm reading about those things, the thing that I have trouble with always is that I need a sense of context. I need to understand what all these places were that are mentioned. You know, when they say somebody played at this place, well, what does that mean exactly? You know, it's a place, we don't know. But what was that experience like? Because we have a better understanding, I think I have a better understanding of what this music was like, what the dancing was like, if I have a framework to hang that on, if I understand what the places were like and what was going on that shaped the nightlife and everything like that. So I set out to do some research on that, particularly here in New York. And as it turns out, there's not really any books that are particularly about that. There's some things that are tangential and kind of cover different aspects of it. So I've put together a lot of different stuff to bring this to you guys, read a lot of different sources. So this series is going to be the history of the golden age of New York City nightclubs. Now, there's a couple things that are subjective in that title. What is the golden age of a nightclub? And what exactly is a nightclub, right? So first of all, what is a nightclub? The term nightclub came into use sometime in the mid-teens, after 1913. What had happened was the mayor at the time, William Gaynor, he was under pressure from social reformers, and we're going to go more into that, but to basically curtail nightlife activities. And so he instituted a 1 a.m. closing time for cabarets, which is the forerunner to what we call nightclubs, right? And in 1914, by the way, when John Purroy Mitchell came in, it was the next mayor after William Gaynor, he extended that curfew to 2 a.m. But most of these places had been staying open until like 3, 4, 5 in the morning, right? And especially people were coming after they went to the theater. So this created a problem because, you know, the theater maybe didn't get out until 11 or 12, especially some of these big, review type shows, Ziegfeld and stuff like that. So these guys were losing a lot of business to this. And what some of them did was they bought up the charters to old private clubs that maybe didn't exist anymore. So private clubs like we think of, like the Players Club or the National Arts Club, or private clubs like that. So people would buy up the charters to these old clubs and then take a back room of their restaurant and say, okay, this is a private club now. Because these rules, as far as nightclubs, or as far as cabarets, it didn't apply to a private club. So what they would do is they would just hand out cards to people. And you're like, you're a member of this club now. And when closing time came around, and they'd all go in the back room and they could keep partying and drinking until late in the night. So that's how the name nightclub comes to be. So in this series, we're going to be looking at nightclubs, not just the ones that came from that club, because then it became a nightclub and cabaret started to become synonymous with each other, right? Particularly by the 20s. And eventually people kind of stop using cabaret. It gets used less and less, and nightclub kind of takes its place. So we're going to look at these cabaret nightclub venues, as well as we'll take a look at like some of the tangential venues that are related to them. Things like, the dance halls and hotel ballrooms a little bit and stuff like that. But our focus will be on the nightclubs, which was the kind of the development of those and things like that. So we're also I want to make clear what we're not going to do is go into a lot of depth about like, and then Paul Whiteman did this, and then this band did this, because this is not necessarily a history of the development of jazz. It's a sort of a history of the things that took place around the development of jazz, right? Like the space in which jazz developed. So I want to make that clear. So the other thing about this is exactly what constitutes the golden age of New York nightclubs, right? So I've said this is the golden age. And I think this is the 1910s to the 1940s. After the 40s, particularly even toward the late 40s, this idea of a nightclub as we knew it, which is, or cabaret as we knew it, which is a big show, a floor show with live music, and then the audience can get up and dance, and there's a dance floor, this big kind of, with food. This starts to go away. There are a few hanger-oners, like a few places like the Copa that keep going, well into the, well past the end of the nightclub era. But in general, after the war, this really starts to decline. And at the end of this, we'll kind of talk about what caused the decline in this. Now, other places it still did exist. For example, in Vegas, this tradition kept on a lot longer as it was marketed to tourists. But in New York City, it really started to die out after the war. And a few places like the Stork and the Copa hung on, but most of them kind of went by the wayside. So, the reason that I think the golden age kind of starts somewhere around 1910 is that this is when the first cabarets come into existence. So previous to this, we had restaurants that maybe had some light entertainment, but it's really in the 1910s that these restaurants with a show and dancing and all of this really start to become a thing. And we're going to look at all the precursors to that as well. Okay, stuff we're not going to cover. We're not going to cover the theater, because even though that is definitely a part of, going out in New York City, it's not necessarily nightlife. It's theater. It's kind of its own thing. Where we will talk about theater is where theater intersects with nightlife, right? Because, for example, in the theater, you've got these reviews, like the Ziegfeld Follies and George White's Scandals and Leslie's Blackbirds and all of these different things, right? The reviews come into the nightclubs. And so we're going to talk about the theater in terms of how it affects the nightclubs, but we're not necessarily going to give a history of theater during this time as well, right? So that's one thing. But one thing I do want to say about theater, though, is that there's a really interesting relationship between the theater, what happens in the theater and what happens in the nightclubs, right? So, as we know, and we'll talk about more, vaudeville is very, very popular in the 1900s, in the 19-teens. And vaudeville starts to decline in the 20s, and more so and more so and more so in the 30s and the 40s until it's dead. So part of this is silent pictures and then talkies hurting vaudeville, right? Part of it is that the stage starts to become a place, again, where people are wanting to see shows with a plot. For a while, it was just these reviews with no plot, or just a very loose thematic thing, right? But it was more about the spectacle of the production. As we get into the 20s, what happens is we start to get shows that are more and more about a through composed musical. And even prior to this, like a musical with a plot would still have just numbers interpolated into it for no reason other than they hope to make a hit song out of the number, or the show needed a hit in it, and it maybe didn't even have anything to do with the plot, or just vaguely to do with the plot, right? And they might not even be from the same composer that wrote the show. It's just stuck in there. As we get into the 20s and into the 30s, musical theater starts to become what we think of it today as these through composed pieces. And part of that is really, I think, the sort of the leader in doing that was Jerome Kern, who was one of the people that said, a theater piece, why are we just sticking these songs? We should create songs in the theater that forward the dramatic action, right? And so Kern is sort of the father of this, and then everybody else, all the younger generation of cats like Gershwin, and like all the cats throughout the 30s and into the 40s, and then once in a while you got like Rodgers and Hammerstein that really kind of take this to a new level with Oklahoma in 43, right? So Showboat is it's the first one of the Kern things that just is huge, and it's this through composed thing, and and then Rodgers and Hammerstein take that even further in the 40s, and this is what we think of as the Broadway musical, right? Porgy and Bess is another great example of this. Meanwhile, though, the vaudeville reviews and things like that are not as popular on the stage. So what happens is these vaudeville acts start to work in the nightclubs. The nightclubs start booking vaudeville reviews and vaudeville performers and producing big, lavish things like you would have seen in the theater. So even though these vaudeville stage reviews, they do go through the 30s, and Ziegfeld dies in 32, and they still produce Ziegfeld Follies for a few years after his death. George White continues on. They start to become more and more of a nightclub thing and less of a theatrical thing as pieces with a plot. Theater pieces with a plot become a thing. And so there's this ascendancy of vaudeville and things like that, and then its decline, while meanwhile these theater things are taking over the stage, and vaudeville then is taking over this nightclub world. So I think that's a really important, like, overall shape thing to understand of all this material we're going to talk about. Okay, so let's just talk about a little bit about what the format of what these are going to look like. So these videos are all going to be somewhere between like 10 and 20 minutes, give or take. And we're going to talk about things basically chronologically, right? We're going to start with kind of precursor to all of this. So what's going on in the 1800s, and then we'll move into the 1900s, and then the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s, and then we'll kind of do a conclusion that wraps up and says, here's what happened to the nightclubs and why they went away, basically. In each section, we're going to take a look at social and political things that were happening that were affecting what was going on in nightlife. So typically we'll do I'll do a video that's about, kind of the social aspects and political aspects and reform movements and all of those things. And then I'll do another video or two or three, just depending on how much stuff there is in each section, on different aspects of it. What we're not going to do is give you a bunch of like a million facts about every nightclub that opened that are just sort of boring. The hope here is that we create a framework to understand what this is all about, and then as you read stuff, as you hear about stuff, as you go to lectures, as you learn more about this, you're going to have a framework within which to place it. So you're going to have a context to better understand anything you learn about jazz, about dance, about even some aspects of theater, right? So so that's how we're going to shape this out. And the first bunch of videos are going to all come out at once here. It's on Patreon. And then the rest of the series will come out once a month. And I hope you guys will subscribe and help support this. It's certainly been a bunch of work. What I do hope to do, I just want to say one other thing as far as the actual clubs themselves. Though we can't talk about, and it would be boring to talk about like every detail of every club, and I mean, we're talking about thousands of nightclubs during this period, right, that existed. I do want to touch on some of them and some of the important people at them, particularly important places that shaped things or that were important because they were just really popular, so that you get a sense of what these places were like. Because then, if you read about another place that they say, oh, well, this was a class club in the late 20s, you might not have heard all the information about that particular club, but instantly now you've got something that like gives you an idea of what hanging out at that place might be like, right? So that's what I hope to give you here, is a big framework with which to work. So we're going to start with the first video in the 1800s, and I will see you there. Total love.